Since season 1 of Lower Decks, we have been hearing tales of the dreaded Starbase 80. This is basically where Starfleet careers go to die. The crew is a hot mess, and the Starbase itself is even worse. It's completely falling apart, it's running off of outdated tech, and it's infested with lice. Ick. In this episode, both Mariner and Captain Freeman have to face their demons, and of course, hilarious shenanigans ensue. I'm so excited that we finally get to see this infamous location during this recap of Season 5, Episode 5, Starbase 80? This episode opens with the crew returning from a second contact away mission on an ocean planet. I love the fact that they're all wearing wetsuits, the bridge is totally soaked, but for them, this is just a typical day in Starfleet. Suddenly, the ship is knocked out of warp because of some kind of navigational issues. The only location within 400 light years that could possibly help them is Starbase 80. Being the worst starbase in the entire quadrant, understandably, the crew is a little reluctant to go there, but they've got no choice. They meet Cassia Knotts, who is commanding SB-80, and she's a little surprised to find out that the crew of the Cerritos is actually not there to help repair the starbase, but they're there to repair the Cerritos. But Captain Freeman decides, why not do both? And that is the perfect setup for our A and B plots for this episode. In the A plot, Mariner and company are ordered by Captain Freeman to do as many minor repairs as they can, while she and Ransom go off to try to find the chief engineer. Now, at the start of this episode, Mariner was telling her friends about how weird and awesome it feels to actually be excited to do her job, especially without any rebellion or angst or self-sabotage. This is a major character glow-up moment for Mariner. She had been previously banished to Starbase 80 for what everyone thought was bad behavior, but it turned out that she actually didn't do anything wrong. Anyways, she's afraid that if she goes back to this part of her old life, it's going to drag her back down and turn her into a person she doesn't want to be. She's convinced that this starbase is cursed, and it turns out she's not totally wrong. As Knopf gives them the grand tour and shows them all the many things they could fix, they discover all of the outdated tech that is currently running the ship. For example, there are no replicators, so instead there are food vendors all throughout the starbase. Also, no one's wearing comm badges because everyone uses wall-mounted comms, and that's important. We're going to come back to that in a minute. Later on, we find out that their turbolifts work with a combination of grabbing and talking that I don't really understand, and we also discover that instead of having a holodeck, they have an arcade, and that's technology from the way back. While Rutherford attempts to do some repairs, we realize that something is going on this starbase. The Cerritos crew is starting to act like these mindless zombies, but instead of eating brains, they're just going around licking everything. Yeah, it's weird. This zombie behavior even affects Rutherford, Tendi, and Boimler, leaving Mariner as one of the few members of the Cerritos crew who is unaffected. Thankfully, Knotts figures out that this behavioral change is somehow initiated by the comm badges and is able to save Mariner in time. The two of them join forces along with Dr. Horseberry and Chad the corn dog guy, and together they get to the bottom of this issue. They discover that an anaphasic life form from the water planet has infected everyone in the ship, starting with the space whales and traveling through the comm badges. Thankfully, Dr. Horseberry is able to remove the anaphasic organism from the space whale, which leads to everyone being instantly returned to normal. Later, they all have a conversation with the anaphasic life form, whose name is Clem, and they discover that he too is a junior officer, which of course he is. Clem was just trying to prove to his superiors that he was capable of communicating with corporeal beings, but he ended up overwhelming himself and taking on way more than he could chew or lick. See what I did there? To Rutherford's astonishment, Knotts is totally okay with leaving Clem on the ship because to her, Starbase 80 is a place of second chances, and she is willing to forgive and forget and move on. Mariner realizes there is no curse, and she was worried for nothing. They handle a few more minor repairs on the starbase, and then they all part as friends. But where are Freeman and Ransom during all of this, you may be wondering? Well, I'm glad you asked. On to our B plot. The B plot is all about Captain Freeman trying to figure out what the heck happened to her in the alternate reality version of herself that we don't meet in Season 5, Episode 1, Dos Cerrito. All we know is that her counterpart was banished to Starbase 80. We don't know why, but we're assuming it was some kind of incompetence or failure that led to this kind of punishment. So now she is determined to beat the Starbase at its own game. Primarily, though, the whole reason why she's there is to find this navigational component from their chief engineer. Freeman and Ransom meet Gene, who is quite a character, who admits that he doesn't know how to fix all these things that are wrong on the Starbase, but that if they go to the arcade, they will find Chief Engineer Jakubowski, who can help get them whatever they need. So naturally, they end up circling the ship for hours trying to find Jakubowski, only to discover that Gene himself is Lieutenant Jakubowski. Naturally, Ransom is furious. In his own words, Starfleet lying to Starfleet is messed up, man. But to be fair, Gene did what he felt he had to do, because clearly they have been asking Starfleet for help probably for decades, for as long as this starbase has existed, and help was not forthcoming. So he pretty much just used Freeman and Ransom to squeeze out the help that Starfleet was not giving willingly. Captain Freeman knows exactly what it feels like to be the bottom of the list of Starfleet's priorities, so she has more compassion and empathy, and she agrees to help them do one last thing before getting the help they need. And that is to clear out all of the bats on subsection 5. At the end of the episode, we see that they've done a pretty good job of clearing out almost all of the bats. There's only one left, and Ransom tells Captain Freeman, look, you have nothing left to prove. Can we just get out of here? But she refuses to let Starbase 80 beat her. And that's where the episode ends. As always, there are so many fun and amazing things that happen through this episode. And I want to highlight some of the tops with the following awards. Best Trek trope goes to Captain Freeman in the very beginning when she says that they're on their way to a captain's conference. I just love this throwback to the idea that they're going to some kind of pointless corporate mixer and that there's a clock running and they've got to be there on time or else who knows what might happen. You know, a lot of times with these ships, we see that they're on their way to save an entire colony or planet or deliver life-saving medication. And the time clock usually is life or death. But I enjoy it every once in a while when it's just some random conference that doesn't really matter. The next award goes to Epic Alien Easter eggs. For this episode, I've highlighted my 4 favorites, but if there's any Easter eggs that you loved that I don't mention, be sure to put them in the comments below. The first is the mention of the Akamarians, who we discover own almost all of this starbase. Now, it took me a minute to place the Akamarians until they said a knife gang. And then I was like, oh my gosh, that's Utah's people. We first meet the Akamarians in season 3, episode 9 of Star Trek The Next Generation, The Vengeance Factor. In this episode, we learn that they call themselves gatherers, but they're basically pirates, bandits, robbers who go around ransacking outposts and things like that. So to me, that does not bode well for Starbase 80, but it must make for a very interesting dynamic. The second shout out goes to Cassia Knotts herself, being an Elorian, which again, this one totally went over my head until Mariner said, wait, like Guinan? And I was like, oh yeah, that's Guinan. The next shout out goes to the anaphasic organism. We first meet anaphasic organisms in season 7, episode 6 of the Next Generation Phantasms. Now, if you don't remember, that's the one where Data was having all these really disturbing dreams. There was a cake shaped like Counselor Troy. It was weird. But the big idea is that these organisms were really hard to detect, but it turns out pretty easy to kill. It's not until this episode, however, that we actually get to chat with them, which is cool. The last shout out goes to Dr. Horseberry. Because this episode has kind of a zombie-like feel, when the Doctor first emerges, it seems like maybe he's infected or coming to attack them or something. But I quickly recognized him as that really cool alien that Geordi turned into in season 4, episode 18 of The Next Generation, Identity Crisis. He mentions that he was infected by a Tarkarian parasite, but that a friend of his told him that it's not really that noticeable. However, Mariner does admit to him that it's kind of noticeable. The episode MVP goes to Cassia Knotts. During this whole thing, we see that Starbase 80 is such a mess, but Knotts is legitimately enthusiastic and positive and hopeful that it can all be turned around. She even volunteered for this post, probably for that reason. And it's just cool to see that somebody can be a Boimler, even in a really terrible situation. Speaking of Boimler, we've got to talk about the Boimler Beard Watch. This stage is just as awkward as all the other stages have been. I am so curious to find out if he's ever going to have that big, thick, full beard by the time we get to the end of the show, or if something's going to happen and he's going to have to shave it all and start over. While watching this episode, I did have a few questions that I just can't get out of my mind. Freeman and Ransom fixed everything just using a fancy tricorder, as Gene called it. They didn't use any other equipment. Mostly they pushed buttons and rewired things. So I guess my question is, why can't they leave Gene a crate of fancy tricorders? So then he and his presumable staff can go around figuring out what needs to be rewired and which buttons to push in order to fix a bunch of problems. Just a thought. Then the other big question I had was about the season arc mystery. It was established back in episode 1 that there's some kind of rip in space-time that's causing alternate realities to come into this reality. And it was revealed in the previous episode that these tears seem intentional. So now the question is, who is doing this? Why are they doing this? What's the end game? Is it just a big mistake? Is it an accident? Is it on purpose? But the bigger question above all of that is, why didn't we talk about it in this episode? episode. We're only going to get 10 episodes to wrap everything up. So I was under the impression that they were going to hit on this arc every single episode and build on it. But instead, it's been kind of a C plot. And I'm okay with that because this episode was so much fun. But I'm just curious how they're going to weave that into the remaining episodes and how they're going to resolve it by the end. Be sure to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed this video. Then click or tap the screen to watch the next video in the series or to start all the way back at the beginning of season 5.